Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. There's been a lot of reports in the press recently about the Chinese use of artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology and other kinds of super surveillance methodology in order to create this enormous overbearing police state that will suppress all opposition. There may be truth to all of this, but what the story is that we don't hear very often, the story we don't hear very often is the amount of resistance that's going on, the opposition, the strikes, the protests that are taking place in China. And that class struggle in China, the struggle of poor and working people against the Chinese billionaire class, not so different than the billionaire class here, I suppose. That struggle is actually extremely active, and now joining us to talk about it is Minqi Li. Minqi is a professor of economics at the University of Utah. He's the author of The Rise of China and the Demise of the Capitalist World Economy and editor of Red China website. Thanks for joining us again, Minqi.
Thank you, Paul.
I interviewed you, boy, it must be 6-7 years ago. I mean, we've interviewed various times over the years. But you were talking about this development of the workers' movement in China, and that the urban workers who had a relatively more sophisticated take on things, that were very disillusioned with the development of capitalism in China and the sort of demise of socialism, and that these workers in the cities were intermingling more with populations coming into the cities from the countryside, who you thought would become more politicized. And that all of this was going to lead to a much stronger workers' movement, and perhaps even a revived workers' movement fighting for a kind of a real socialism. Is that happening?
It is happening. And so since we have been talking about this, and then Chinese workers' resistance and protests have been developing. So according to the Hong Kong-based China Labor Bulletin, over the first half of 2018 and nationwide, according to their count, there had been about 900 major worker strikes or protests throughout the country.
That was 900?
More than 900. And that represents a doubling compared to what happened over the same period last year. And then by comparison back to the year of 2011, and there were only about 200 such workers' protests according to this China Labor Bulletin.
And what about the kinds of protests we sometimes hear about in villages and otherwise? Sometimes you hear it's in the thousands.
Yeah, there were also thousands of, in China, they call it mass incidents, which increased to something like 20,000 and by the year of 2016. And unfortunately, and those kind of data used to be collected by a social media called non-news. And this non-news social media was arrested by the Chinese government last year. So right now, we don't have very updated information with respect to this kind of mass incidents.
And what's the attitude of the Chinese government, state, towards these 900 major worker strikes? I mean, one of the selling points of China to the world is a workforce that goes along and is able to work for especially foreign enterprises without such disruption.
Well, apparently the Chinese worker force has become a little bit less disciplined from the capitalist perspective. With respect to the Chinese government, they have been using a two-pronged strategy. So on the one hand, they try to use some repression, using perhaps the most high-tech repressive machine, as you described. But as we know, this repression cannot be targeted towards everyone. And so what typically happen is that they target the worker leaders or the leading activists and arrest them or warn them. But on the other hand, they would also make a little bit concession if the protest becomes sufficiently large.
The extent of these workers' strikes and other protests, is it taking on a political form? Is it possible in China, whether in an underground way or open way, that there's
Well,
actual political organizations coming out of this that challenge the policy authority of the Chinese party?
Well, the workers' protests themselves, of course, are primarily directed towards economic demands about wage, about working conditions. As you know, formal political organization in China is still illegal, other than the Communist Party itself. But these days, there have been a new politically awakened young college students and who have been influenced by leftist ideas, to be precise, Marxist ideas. And many of them now have become active, and some of them now have been involved in this kind of worker protests. And there are lots of social media within China, and that have been talking about this kind of development.
The theory of a one-party state, the leftist, socialist, communist theory, is that you don't need a multi-party system because the struggle takes place inside the party, and that there's in the party there's room for a real debate and fight over the policy and such. With President Xi, and who's also chairman of the party, being declared at the level of Mao Zedong and essentially leader for life, it amounts to, is there any room left in the party itself for actual debate or dissent?
Now, that is, of course, the official doctrine, right? So the party represents the interests of people. But the party has changed. It used to be that, for the Communist Party, it's supposed to represent the interests of the working class. But over time, and not only they have changed with respect to substance, they have also changed the language in the party constitution. So now it's no longer just the representative of the working class, but the people at large, in effect, the representative of the capitalist class. And then Xi Jinping himself, of course, is more interested in centralization of the power within the party around himself, and then provide accommodation for the broad sections of the exploited social classes.
At the last party congress, Xi Jinping declared a sort of renewed commitment to the ideas of Marx, and I think was suggesting or saying people should start reading Marx again, and that the Chinese party is still within the tradition of Marxist thought. How do they get their head around, if they believe this, in the emergence of such a big billionaire class, and not just the emergence of a billionaire class, but lots of the party leadership themselves are billionaires?
Well, the official way to get around is that they have developed Marxism. And so they have developed Marxism to accommodate reform and openness, to accommodate neoliberalism as well as the financial liberalization. And so that would allow them to claim to still have something to do with Marx, but on the other hand, in fact, developing capitalism.
So how do they, people, if they actually take the advice and start reading Marx, they're going to see that what's going on now in development in China has not much to do with what Marx talked about.
Well, the truth is that, of course, the majority of the Chinese people, whether we are talking about the capitalists or the workers or the urban middle class, probably do not take these words very seriously. The only section that might have benefited from this has to do with those official Marxist academic departments in the various Chinese universities. And because of this statement, they can claim more funding.
Which buys into the capitalist model as well, I suppose.
Right.
How do you see this unfolding over the next few years? This world economy seems to be extremely fragile. The geopolitical rivalry is heating up greatly, and it's not just Trump, but the hysteria against Putin and Russia, and the rhetoric that's taking place about Putin on American media and so on in American politics. Right now, it's all focused on Russia. I suppose it wouldn't take much someday for it to be focused on China. And the financial shenanigans are back on full blown. The kind of speculative activity that triggered the 07-08 crisis, whatever regulation there was here is essentially gone. They're talking about even more deregulation, which I would think must concern the Chinese. The Chinese own a heck of a lot of American dollars, and this wild speculative activity that's going on and is going to get worse. Who knows where that leads? How do you see this affecting domestic politics in China?
Well, the Chinese model has been based on this exploitation of cheap labor force, cheap natural resources, as well as a stable global order under the American hegemonic power. And so these conditions have allowed China to maintain political stability at home as well as rapid income growth for several decades. But all of these conditions are being undermined. And so I would expect these contradictions, the economic contradictions, political contradictions, and as well as ecological contradictions will converge upon the Chinese model of capitalism at some point, probably in the next decade also. So the next decade will be very interesting.
And people talk about a debt bomb. I mean, is there a debt bomb in China? And if so, when might it explode?
Well, the Chinese debt level, depending on how you measure it, because you have different measurements. But let's say if we talk about the non-financial sector debt, excluding the government, it increased from about 100% of GDP before the 2009 crisis and to about 200% these days. And it has stabilized somewhat in the year of 2016, 2017. But now with the renewed housing bubble, this debt growth probably will renew again. So that will become a new source of instability for the Chinese
also
economy.
Household debt is very high, not just state, right?
Household debt, yes, also growing. And although the major part of that is still the corporate sector debt. So that will be a new source of instability for the Chinese economy.
But is it exaggerating what we're hearing in the Western press, calling it a debt bomb?
I would say that this debt probably would not be the only reason that could destabilize the Chinese economy. The more important challenge may come from the growing social conflicts, as well as China's growing dependence on oil and natural gas imports. And so these factors together will make the Chinese economy vulnerable.
Which would then must scare the heck out of China, this aggressive policy of Trump's administration towards Iran. China makes a lot of use of Iranian oil, and not only Iranian oil, but the price of oil could go through the roof if there's a real conflict.
Well, I guess China is not the only major capitalist government who is very concerned about this Iranian crisis. But and not only we have lots of uncertainty about the global capital system, and there's also lots of uncertainty about the Trump administration's policy, and then perhaps the American capitalist class will find a way to persuade Trump to be rational.
Well, I think there's a section of the class that thinks he is being rational, and right now they control the White House. Well, we'll see how it unfolds. Thanks for joining us, Minqi.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.